Feeding and cuddling your baby to sleep is a loving and wonderful experience, creating a beautiful bond between you and your baby. However, as they grow, there comes a time to transition away from this habit and start to establish a more independent sleep routine. In today's video, I will reveal a step-by-step guide on how to wean your baby gently from feeding to sleep while still nurturing that precious bond between you both. So how do you wean your baby or feeding to sleep? Start by making your baby's sleep space conducive to sleep. Now they're not going to be relying on the feeding in order to make them go to sleep. They're going to need that sleep environment to be absolutely perfect and encourage them to fall asleep. So now they need new sleep associations such as a white noise machine, and the room should be preferably dimly lit or dark. So I would use some blackout blinds. So you're making that room very cozy and ready for sleep. It's also helpful if you can teach your baby during the day to be comfortable lying in their crib while awake. And this is a really good tip that can make this feeding to sleep weaning process a lot easier. And if you want to learn how to do that, then watch this video in where I explain exactly how to get your baby accustomed to being in their crib while awake. And if your baby is 6 months or older, you might consider moving them to their own room. Sometimes this can really help in breaking the feeding to sleep association for both you and your baby. The next step I would suggest is that you start by stopping feeding at nap times. So if you are feeding your baby to sleep at nap times, the first place to start with the weaning process is during the day. You are going to be less tired and more committed to the weaning process. So you want to structure your day now that your baby's having more structured nap times so that you are not feeding them to sleep. And I would also suggest that during the day you feed your baby in a common house space where there's other things going on. Don't feed them in their sleep space during the day. You want to make feeding completely separate to sleeping. Thirdly, create a sleep routine that does not finish with a feed. So now that your baby is old enough to have a more definitive bedtime routine, you can sandwich that feed in the middle of the bedtime routine. So for instance, you can have a nice calming bath, then you can have a baby massage, then you provide breast or bottle feed, then you snuggle up and look at some books, and then you put your baby down to sleep. By doing this, you are giving your baby new sleep associations. You're creating them an environment that's conducive to sleep with new things to become accustomed to. So the bath is calming, the massage is calming, sitting cuddling with you with books is calming, and they're not solely relying on the feed in order to prepare them for sleep. Another good thing is to ask your partner to sometimes put your little one to bed. This can really help break the feeding to sleep association, especially if you are breastfeeding. Now my fourth point is really for those of you who are really struggling with breaking the feeding to sleep cycle. So you might have tried the things that I've suggested and that's still not working and your baby's screaming blue murder. Well, in that case, and it might be really difficult for you as well, because I know how hard it is to give this up, try and reduce the amount of time that you are feeding your baby to sleep so you can do a weaning of that whole experience. So you feed your baby until they're sort of 90% asleep and then you put them down. Then you feed them until they are 80% asleep and put them down. You gradually reduce it until you are feeding them for a very, very short space of time before you put them down to sleep. And the key here is that they are awake when you put them down and not fast asleep. Some people might find this easier than doing the other things that I've suggested, or you might want to try this first and then incorporate the other things. It really depends on you and your baby and how you're getting on with the whole weaning process. You also need to make sure that you spend lots of loving time with your baby during the day. Now, feeding to sleep can be a very precious experience, but it's the feeding that is precious, and you're not going to stop feeding your baby. You're just going to stop the sleeping bit. So you need to spend a lot of bonding time with your baby doing other bonding things. You can still cuddle them, you can sing songs to them, you can have lots of cozy play together. Now they're getting older, you're going to be interacting with them on so many different levels, and there'll be so many more opportunities of bonding. Now be careful though that you don't end up rocking your baby to sleep, because you'll end up having to wean them off that further down the line. And it's very easy when you give up feeding your baby to sleep to fall into the rocking your baby to sleep. That's just something you need to be aware of. And you also should try not to rush in every time your baby wakes. It's very tempting when you're coming out of those early months that you've been so used to responding to every cry that your baby has that you need to feed them. And in those early weeks and months, that was what you needed to do. But as they grow, that's not the case. Sometimes your baby will wake just because they want the comfort of sucking in order to go back to sleep again. It doesn't mean they're hungry. So depending on their age, you'll know whether they are due a feed or not. If they're due a feed, of course you go in and you feed them, and then you put them back down to sleep. However, if they're not due for a feed, you know they're not hungry, then pause for a bit. See if they will resettle themselves. So if they're just grizzling and fussing, don't go in. Obviously, if they get really upset, you do need to go in. And here you might like to start using a pacifier. I know it still means you're getting up. It means you putting the pacifier in the baby's mouth until they're old enough to do it themselves. But it does mean that they're relying on the sucking process to fall asleep. They're not relying on you holding them and feeding them to sleep. And it is a really good interim resource to use and can provide your baby with a lot of comfort, and it lets them go back to sleep and you go back to sleep much more quickly. And finally, if your baby is over a year old, there is a lot more things that you can do to offer alternative comfort for your baby, especially when they're learning to fall asleep independently. So you can give them a lovey, you can give them a blanket that they are attached to, you can play an audiobook, you can put a ceiling projector up, you can actually use those for slightly younger children as well. So you're providing your little one with something else to help them settle rather than being fed to sleep. Weaning your baby off being fed to sleep can be a tricky experience for both you and your baby. I understand how bonding it is. I've been there and I know how hard it is to give it up sometimes. But remember that you're not giving up the feeding. You're not giving up that bonding. You're just giving up feeding them to sleep. And in my experience, the earlier you start, the better. It's easier on you and it's certainly easier on your baby. Because when it comes to weaning them off the bottle and the breast completely, if you've got to wean them off being fed to sleep as well, that's a really steep mountain for them to climb. And so you are in fact making things easier for them down the line if you have broken that sleep to feed cycle earlier on. I hope you found today's video helpful, and please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Thank you for watching.